I think now, before the Game Awards on December 11, it is time to talk not only about the positive aspects of Resident Evil 9 and franchise in general, but also about some issues that may stand out from the overall picture. And these issues were created by the Capcom itself. I saw an interesting comment under my YouTube post where the user is dissatisfied with how modern Capcom and director Koshi Nakanishi are handling Resident Evil lore, especially in Resident Evil Requiem and its connections to past games like Resident Evil Outbreak. The author believes that Capcom is breaking the Resident Evil canon and mixing incompatible timelines from Resident Evil games. I find this comment quite interesting because the arguments presented in it are quite compelling and 100% suitable for our joint discussion. In this video, I will outline these three main issues mentioned by the author so that we can discuss them together with respect and appreciation for other viewers. My name is Scyris Nova and welcome to my new discussion video about Capcom and Resident Evil franchise. Let's immediately start with the first argument, and it is about Capcom and their inconsistency with two different canons of Resident Evil, original series and remake series. The author begins by arguing that Resident Evil 9 takes place in the same timeline as the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. Yet the developers of Resident Evil 9 hint that the game seems to be connected to the Resident Evil Outbreak spin-offs, at least through Alyssa Ashcroft. To him, these represent completely different canons that were never meant to intersect. And it is actually true because if we look on these two different timelines, we can see that Resident Evil original series are separate from the Resident Evil engine games like, remakes and trilogy of Ethan's story. It is proved that they differ from each other by, for example, different maps of Raccoon City, sequence of certain events in a story, etc. and etc. That's why it's called remake, like reimagining of an original story and by that reworked timeline. But because of that, he thinks combining them is inherently illogical and shows a misunderstanding or disrespect of the original canon. The foundation of his argument is the difference in how the destruction of Raccoon City is portrayed, and here is by the way where the second issue from Capcom stands out, namely the problem of a single thermobaric missile which differs from Resident Evil Outbreak scenario. In Resident Evil 3 Remake, the city was wiped out by a single thermobaric bomb as a part of the Bacillus Terminate operation. This, he says, resulted in one massive crater that still exists 30 years later, and we can see this in the very first Resident Evil 9 trailer. In the Resident Evil Outbreak series, however, Raccoon City was destroyed by multiple missiles launched from a base in Texas during Operation Angel's Arrow, leaving several craters rather than one. To him, this is not just a small inconsistency but clear proof that the two timelines do not match and cannot logically coexist. And again, these statements are confirmed just by simple cutscenes from Resident Evil 3 Remake and Resident Evil Outbreak. In Resident Evil 3 Remake, for example, we see how only one missile flies past Jill and Carlos and falls somewhere in the city center. In Resident Evil Outbreak, we see a footage of several missiles that fly sequentially to their designated targets and in the end completely destroy the city. Of course, we can assume that Capcom didn't expect to go so far with the Resident Evil franchise on that time, and that they didn't even think that they'd be returning to this outcome after the Raccoon City incident. So for now, they've simply had to discard the Resident Evil Outbreak scenario and rely on an updated timeline then. But why hasn't Capcom officially announced this yet? The question of canon accuracy is still up in the air and no one has been able to explain, so which timeline is correct? Kumazawa, in his recent interviews, said that Resident Evil fans have recently become confused about what information is true and what is pathetic fakery, so he urged fans to wait for an official information from Capcom. There are just over 3 months left until the game's release, and this question still remains open. Personally, I assume that Resident Evil Requiem will, like the previous two Resident Evil games, continue the line of remakes. After all, most players know these games and not the older originals that most OGs played. Therefore, to attract more players to the Resident Evil franchise and maximize the profits from purchasing the new game as well as, its collector's items, merchandise, additional content, etc., the game will continue the remake line. And it's just simple as that. From this, he draws the conclusion that characters originating from Outbreak, specifically Alyssa Ashcroft, should not appear in Resident Evil 9 at all. That's where the third issue from Capcom highlights, namely the problem of Alyssa Ashcroft, the character from original canon appearing in timeline of remakes. He emphasizes that Alyssa is strongly tied to the Outbreak version of events, and not to the Resident Evil 9 version of the Raccoon City incident. Considering that Resident Evil 9 and Resident Evil Outbreak are games from different canonical timelines, it is illogical to drag a character from one Resident Evil canon to another. He also criticizes her updated appearance in Resident Evil 9 and focuses heavily on the fact that the game introduces a daughter, Grace Ashcroft, the main protagonist of the game, even though the original Outbreak lore never mentioned Alyssa having a child. To him, this is another sign that Capcom is inventing new elements that contradict what longtime fans know. These two constituent aspects would be insignificant in themselves if Capcom clarified the sequence of the Resident Evil canon as well as its correctness. On the other hand, Capcom has a full right to reinvent the character's past or even completely rewrite him and introduce a new version in a new canon. By that, they could argue that Alyssa in Resident Evil 9 is not the Alyssa from Outbreak, but like a new interpretation of hers. But given that Resident Evil 9's main idea is uncovering the secret of Raccoon City and finishing off the Umbrella Corporation, this argument is utterly irrelevant, as we remember Alyssa exactly as she was in Resident Evil Outbreak. If you wanna go back to the roots, then go back to them and don't mix it up with different timelines. But again, the issue here is not about the canonical nature of the overall plot, but about attracting new players to the Resident Evil franchise as effectively as possible and introducing them to the storyline of games created with RE Engine. The commenter also recalled the latest news from Kumazawa's interview where he mentioned the return of characters from Resident Evil Outbreak in the new game. Their situation is exactly the same as with Alyssa, but then we can conclude that canonically, Resident Evil 9 continues the remake series, but from the perspective of the plot and setting, it includes a mix of events from the remakes and the original Resident Evil franchise games. In this case, the Resident Evil Outbreak spin-offs. For now, that's the only conclusion I can draw. After shedding the light on these issues, we can confidently say that the Resident Evil franchise has its own unanswered questions. These videos are not meant to humiliate Capcom or fuel hatred for this incredible company. We make such videos to show how we really take care of our lovely game and lovely horror franchise, and simultaneously how we take care of Capcom and their strategy of the game development. I personally believe that things need to be looked at from both sides, assessing both sides of the coin in every situation. Share your thoughts on these arguments in the comments. Do you agree with the author's opinion? For now, the question remains open. Capcom, what's wrong? What are you doing with the Resident Evil franchise?